Welcome back. In today's episode, we're looking at the most terrifying Grand Canyon deaths ever recorded. From a teacher who ignored flash flood warnings and entered a narrow canyon alone, to a man whose engagement party stunt ended in devastating tragedy. It was June 22nd, 2018, and the parking lot near the South Rim Village sat empty past midnight, lit by a single overhead lamp casting a pale circle across the asphalt, where a hatchback with Oregon plates idled near a sign listing shuttle schedules and trail regulations. Elam Orozco was 23 years old and worked as a bike courier in Portland, earning roughly $14 an hour peddling deliveries through downtown traffic. His roommate later told investigators Elam had been planning his Grand Canyon trip for weeks, calling it the free version. No backcountry permit, no campground reservation, no guided tour. The plan was to descend the South Kaibab Trail at 2 a.m., sleep on a ledge below the rim out of ranger sight, and hike out before morning patrols. His roommate also described his gear. The headlamp was a dollar store model he had owned for 3 years. The batteries had never been replaced. His pack contained a sleeping pad, a thin blanket, 2 energy bars, and a single liter of water. No backup light, no map, no satellite communicator. He told his roommate he would be back by Tuesday, but gave no itinerary and no specific return date. And I think that right there is what makes this one so much worse. Nobody was expecting him anywhere. There was no one waiting for a call that didn't come. The road to the South Kaibab trailhead is closed to private vehicles. Elam parked in the general lot and walked roughly 20 minutes to the trailhead, a workaround he had found on hiking forums. The trail has no water sources, no tree cover, and no guardrails on its exposed switchbacks. Cloud cover that night blocked any moonlight. Beyond the rim, the canyon was a void. Investigators later reconstructed what followed entirely from physical evidence on the trail. He descended at a normal pace. His boot prints held the established path cleanly for roughly the first mile, steady, evenly spaced, someone who believed his light would hold. At a steep switchback approximately 1.2 miles below the rim, where the trail bends sharply with a severe drop-off on the outer edge, the packed surface and the loose gravel beyond it look nearly the same in low visibility. In daylight, the drop-off is unmistakable. In total darkness, the distinction all but disappears. No curb, no edge, no obvious change in ground feel to tell a hiker where the trail ends and the air begins. His boot prints crossed that boundary. Scuff marks appeared in the loose gravel at the trail's outer edge, along with a small fan of displaced rock pushed outward, 1 foot stepping past the packed surface and finding nothing solid beneath it. The terrain off the edge drops roughly 40 feet onto a narrow rock shelf before continuing steeply into deeper canyon terrain. Elam's body was found on that shelf, face down, his pack still on, the headlamp strapped to his forehead with the switch in the on position and the bulb dark. He was not found for 2 days. The shelf sat below the sightline of hikers on the upper switchbacks, despite heavy daily traffic on the trail. A hiker descending 2 days later spotted his body from a lower switchback at an angle that revealed the ledge. No missing person report had been filed. His roommate assumed he was still traveling. His car sat in the general lot, indistinguishable among dozens left by multi-day backpackers. But falling 40 feet onto a rock shelf did not kill Elam Orozco. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be severe hyperthermia and dehydration. Injuries from the fall, a fractured pelvis and multiple rib fractures, were debilitating but not immediately fatal. Drag marks in the dust extended roughly 6 feet from his landing position to where his body was found. His water bottle was recovered empty. Daytime temperatures on exposed South Kaibab rock exceed 130 degrees at ground level in June. He lay on that shelf, immobilized, no water, no shade, no phone signal, and no way for anyone to know he was there, through what investigators estimated was most of the following day in direct sun. I've sat with that detail for a while now, and it's the worst thing in this entire video. He survived the fall, He was alive when the sun came up, and the canyon cooked him in broad daylight while hundreds of hikers walked directly above him. The headlamp he never replaced the batteries in put him on that shelf. The desert finished it. The Park Service referenced the incident in a seasonal advisory about unpermitted night hiking. Elam's identity was confirmed after rangers traced his plates to a Portland address and contacted his roommate.
It was May 6, 2018, when late morning heat pressed against the canyon walls roughly 650 feet below the Grand Canyon's south rim. The upper cliff face was carved into deep recesses and overhangs of pale sandstone, and a steep limestone face dropped away below the trail, its lower reaches disappearing beneath a broad overhang. Phoebe Tulloch was 44 years old and worked as a real estate agent in Scottsdale, Arizona. She had traveled to the Grand Canyon that week with a specific goal: to recreate a photograph she had seen online. Friends later described her as someone who treated desert terrain the way she treated open houses. Familiar ground she believed she could read at a glance. She had no technical climbing background. The photo, taken from across the canyon at a different elevation, showed a wide recessed ledge beneath an overhang with an unobstructed panoramic view. The image had been the wallpaper on her phone for nearly a month. Friends later told investigators she referenced it constantly, describing exactly where she would stand and what time of day the light would be perfect. The ledge could be reached by leaving the trail and descending a 35-foot limestone face using natural handholds visible from above. No barrier marked the departure point. A solo hiker ahead of Phoebe later told rangers he watched her step off the trail and begin climbing down toward the recess below the overhang. Photos recovered from Phoebe's phone later confirmed she reached the ledge. The images matched the same angle seen in the social media photo she had been trying to recreate. The ledge itself measured roughly 12 feet wide and 6 feet deep beneath the overhang. There was no water and no visible route continuing downward. Investigators believe the problem began when Phoebe attempted to climb back out. Scrape marks and disturbed rock on the limestone face showed where her hands and shoes had searched for purchase. The same holds that allowed a descent from above angled away when approached from below, offering little grip for upward movement. A second section of the face showed broken handholds that had crumbled under pressure. Farther east, disturbed rock plates marked a third attempt. Investigators estimated she climbed roughly 15 feet before the fractured surface shifted and slid, sending loose debris back down toward the ledge. Evidence on the rock face suggested repeated attempts over an extended period. Based on the timeline provided by the solo hiker, investigators estimated Phoebe remained trapped on the ledge for several hours during the peak afternoon heat. By that point, the surrounding south-facing sandstone walls had been absorbing direct sunlight for hours. The overhang trapped heat within the recess, hot rock radiating inward from three sides while the overhang blocked airflow. The solo hiker later reported the off-trail descent to a ranger while returning along the trail. Rangers searched the area above first before initiating an off-trail response. The overhang concealed the ledge from the rim and limited visibility from helicopter observation along the canyon face. Technical rescue teams staged overnight and rappelled down the following morning. When responders reached the ledge, Phoebe was unresponsive. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death to be heat stroke and hyperthermia resulting from prolonged exposure. Investigators concluded the recessed ledge had created an enclosed heat pocket where surrounding rock radiated absorbed solar heat inward, producing temperatures significantly higher than the surrounding canyon air. The Trail Authority later installed off-trail warning signage at the departure point along the South Kaibab Trail. Phoebe's phone, recovered from the ledge, still contained the photographs she had taken recreating the image. A caption for the post had already been drafted in her notes app. It was never published. It was May 27, 2016, at the Bright Angel Trailhead on Grand Canyon's south rim, where early tourists crowded near the canyon's edge before the heat arrived. A man crouched with a juniper stick to move a coiled rattlesnake and never made it home. Kurt Bellamy, 38, worked as a small equipment mechanic outside Denver, mostly servicing skid steers, trenchers, and small excavators used by landscaping crews and utility contractors. The work kept him outdoors more than most shop mechanics. He spent long stretches at construction yards and equipment depots scattered along Colorado's Front Range, often stepping around scrap lumber, irrigation piping, and sun-warmed gravel lots where snakes occasionally turned up. He had grown up clearing fence lines on his uncle's cattle property near Pueblo, where rattlesnakes were common and sometimes turned up under feed troughs or irrigation culverts. Bellamy had handled them and said so often, usually describing it as something routine from those summers working pasture repairs. He wasn't a practiced hiker. The Arizona trip was a long weekend with co-worker Martin Keene, 41, who had been talking for months about seeing the canyon in person after a supplier conference brought them both within driving distance. Their plan was loose: walk part of Bright Angel Trail before the midday heat, take photos, and be back in town by the afternoon. Bellamy carried no trail gear and no emergency equipment. At 9:10 a.m., a 4-foot Grand Canyon pink rattlesnake lay coiled in the shade at the base of the trailhead signboard, pressed against the post on cooler ground. Several hikers had already noticed it and were keeping their distance along the edge of the trailhead clearing. Bellamy picked up a juniper stick and told the group he would move it before someone was hurt. Lydia, a retired biology teacher from Tucson, standing roughly 12 feet away, told him directly to leave it alone. Bellamy crouched within 2 feet of the snake and prodded it near the tail. The snake tightened its coil and lifted the tail as the rattle accelerated into a dry buzzing warning. He prodded again near the mid-body. The strike was immediate. Lydia later told rangers the snake barely appeared to move. Bellamy's left hand jerked backward. 2 fang punctures were visible within seconds between his thumb and index finger, both bleeding. The surrounding tissue began swelling within minutes. A nearby visitor flagged a park ranger walking the rim trail. The ranger examined the wound and radioed dispatch recommending medical evacuation. Bellamy refused on cost grounds and said he felt fine. He and Keene began descending the trail. At 0.7 miles below the rim, uphill hikers found Bellamy seated on a trailside rock, while Keene wrapped his hand with a bandana. The swelling had moved past the wrist. He was sweating and complained of nausea and dizziness. At one point 3 miles from the rim, he collapsed onto the trail. His arm was swollen to the elbow, his face pale gray, his breathing shallow. Keene could not rouse him. Keene flagged a passing hiker carrying a satellite messenger who contacted park dispatch at 11:32 a.m. Rangers reached Bellamy approximately 48 minutes later. He was unconscious with intermittent breathing. A helicopter transported him to a regional hospital in Flagstaff, arriving roughly 2 hours after he collapsed. Antivenom was administered on arrival, but organ failure had already advanced due to the treatment delay. Renal failure developed during the progression of the systemic collapse. Bellamy died 31 hours after the bite. Park officials issued a brief seasonal advisory against approaching or relocating snakes on park trails. The incident was logged in the annual Park Incident Report and received limited regional news coverage. Keene gave a statement to rangers and left that afternoon. No policy changes followed, and the trailhead resumed normal traffic the following morning.
It was September 18th, 2021, at the Grand Canyon. The weather was clear and many visitors were hiking the trails and taking photographs of the scenery. Tobias Marcy Zahir was 34 years old and lived in Phoenix, Arizona. He worked as a web designer and enjoyed outdoor photography. During his visit to the Grand Canyon, he hoped to capture unique pictures of the landscape. Earlier that day, Tobias heard hikers talking about a mountain lion that had been spotted nearby. Excited by the possibility of seeing one in the wild, he became determined to find it and take a photograph. And I completely understand why that caught his attention. Seeing a mountain lion is rare. The chance to photograph one would feel like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. As he continued hiking, Tobias began paying more attention to the surrounding terrain than to the trail itself. Several times he stopped to scan the rocky slopes and patches of brush in hopes of spotting the animal. hours passed without success. Frustrated but still determined, Tobias continued searching the area for signs of the animal. But the moment he decided that getting a photograph was more important than staying on the marked trail, he began taking risks he normally wouldn't have taken. The animal disappeared behind a ridge. Instead of remaining on the designated path, Tobias deliberately left the trail and started following the direction the mountain lion had traveled. Several warning signs in the area advised visitors not to leave marked routes because of unstable terrain and the danger of becoming lost. Tobias ignored those warnings. Convinced the photograph would be worth it, he continued deeper into unfamiliar ground.
I've noticed that people rarely decide to get lost. They make a series of small choices that slowly carry them farther and farther away from where they should be.
Eventually, Tobias spotted movement behind a cluster of boulders. A mountain lion suddenly emerged from behind the rocks only a short distance away. Both froze for several seconds before the animal turned and disappeared into the brush. Relieved, Tobias decided to leave. But as he turned around, he realized he had wandered much farther from the trail than he thought. The terrain around him was steep and unfamiliar. Trying to retrace his route, Tobias began crossing a rocky slope. Loose stones shifted beneath his feet. He lost his balance and stumbled. Tobias slipped and tumbled down the hillside, striking multiple rocks as he fell. His body rolled across the rough ground, hitting boulders and jagged edges. He fell over 50 feet before finally coming to a stop far below. The fall left him badly injured. Dazed and in severe pain, he attempted to stand but immediately collapsed. One of his legs appeared broken. Several of his belongings had been scattered during the fall. When he reached for his phone, he discovered the screen had shattered and the device would no longer function. Unable to call for help, Tobias remained where he had fallen. After searching several sections of the canyon, rescuers eventually located Tobias. He was still alive but had suffered severe injuries from the 50-foot fall. Despite rescue efforts, he later died from complications caused by those injuries. Investigators concluded that while the delay in reaching him likely worsened his condition, the fall itself was the primary cause of death.
It was the 27th of April, 2018, at a backcountry campsite near the Colorado River, a place where canyon walls absorb sound. The nearest road is hours of trail away, and the margin between an ordinary evening and an irreversible one can disappear without warning. Zadie Finn was 41 and worked as a middle school art teacher in Brisbane, Australia. Her colleagues described her as practical and thorough. She had spent 3 years saving vacation time for this trip, her first serious backcountry experience in the United States. It's worth noting that she was physically fit, prepared by every reasonable measure, and had no known history of allergic reactions. On the second evening, Zadie collected firewood along the camp perimeter while her partner prepared dinner near the fire ring. Dead wood lay scattered through the area, half buried in sand and debris near a cottonwood stand at the edge of camp. She lifted a wide piece of dead trunk lying flat against the ground. What was underneath had been there before. The nest was embedded in the sand beneath the wood, a yellow jacket colony, disturbed from below. The stings came within seconds. Her partner later told investigators she shouted and stepped back, assuming they were wasps at first, despite the unusually sharp, immediate pain characteristic of multiple yellow jacket stings. She brushed at her arms and returned toward the fire because nothing in her experience gave her reason to do otherwise. I would have done the same, toughing out the stings. Unfortunately for her, within minutes, a flush spread across her chest and neck, visible even in the firelight. Her partner noticed her voice change first, a rasp, described to investigators as sounding like smoke in her lungs. She began coughing. She tried to drink water and could not swallow it. The blotches across her neck darkened and rose beneath the skin. Imagine that window. Imagine the few minutes where neither of them understood what was happening. A second hiker camped roughly 40 yards upriver came toward the fire. Both witnesses described what followed as escalating without pause. Her breathing became loud and strained, a sound both said they had never heard before. She was standing, then leaning against the fire ring, then on the ground. Her face and neck had visibly distorted from swelling. She clawed at her throat with both hands. Her partner said afterward there was no moment it seemed manageable. I don't think anyone at that campsite was equipped for what they were watching. That's not a criticism, it's just the truth. But as her breathing worsened, they realized there was no working satellite communicator or radio at the fire ring, only distance-dependent cell phones that had no signal in the canyon, forcing them to split so one person could climb to higher ground to attempt contact while the other remained with Zadie. It was the second hiker who reached dispatch using a personal emergency communicator. By the time contact was established, Zadie had stopped breathing. Canyon depth and full darkness delayed helicopter access for nearly 3 hours. Park rangers later confirmed the reaction had progressed too rapidly for survival, even with a faster response. The autopsy identified anaphylactic shock triggered by multiple yellow jacket stings and a previously undiagnosed hypersensitivity. Cause of death was listed as systemic cardiovascular collapse and complete upper airway obstruction. Her partner gave a statement to investigators and declined all contact afterward. The campsite remained in use. I find it difficult to locate a clean ending here. Zadie saved years of vacation time for this trip. She was prepared by every measure available to her. The nest was already there when she arrived, and nothing she knew told her to look for it.
It was April 9th, 2016, and heavy mist drifted upward from a 190-foot waterfall deep inside a tribal reservation side canyon west of the main Grand Canyon corridor, where red walls funneled the roar of falling water into a sound that drowned out conversation beyond 10 feet. Jessamine Hightower was 33 years old and worked as a travel nurse on a 13-week contract at a hospital in southern Nevada. Between shifts, she hiked locations across the Southwest for a blog she had maintained for 2 years. 30 bucket list hikes before her 35th birthday. The waterfall was number 22. Her hiking partner, a respiratory therapist from a previous assignment, later told investigators that Jessamine planned the entire trip around a single available day between shifts. The itinerary required a 10-mile hike in, the waterfall descent, photos, and the 10-mile return, all before she needed to sleep ahead of a 12-hour night shift the following evening. Her partner described her checking the stopwatch on her phone between every rest stop, insisting they reach the falls by noon for the light. There was no professional photography obligation. The light in the narrow canyon was consistent at any hour. By the time they reached the waterfall, Jessamine had been hiking for nearly 5 hours in canyon heat near 90 degrees. Other hikers at the falls were resting and hydrating before attempting the descent. A steep, partially tunneled route down the cliff face beside the falls, roughly 60 vertical feet, with metal chains bolted into wet travertine rock as the only handhold. Most hikers took 15 to 20 minutes, methodically testing each foothold and resting their forearms between moves. Jessamine started down immediately. A group of 3 hikers sitting at the top of the chains watched her go. One of them later told investigators he almost said something. She hadn't taken a drink of water, hadn't sat down, hadn't even set her pack down. She just walked to the edge and started climbing over. A hiker ascending in the opposite direction later told investigators she moved past him quickly, gripping the chain with both hands and stepping down without testing footholds first. He described her hands as visibly wet, mist, and sweat. He pressed himself flat against the wall to let her pass and watched her continue downward at what he called twice the pace of anyone else he had seen on the chains that day. He said she never once stopped to rest her forearms or shake out her grip the way every other hiker did on the descent. Roughly 40 feet into the 60-foot descent, the ascending hiker, now above her and still watching, saw her rhythm change. Her right hand repositioned on the chain twice in quick succession instead of moving to the next link. Her left foot searched for a hold, slipped, found another. Her movements were no longer fluid. Her right hand slid down the chain, not a controlled release, but a slow giving way. The mineral film on the wet metal defeating what was left of her grip. Her left hand held for another half second, fingers tightening, knuckles locked. Then her left foot slipped off its hold, and the sudden drop of her lower body weight ripped her remaining hand from the chain. I went back through that detail several times, because that's not one clean mistake. That's everything failing at once. Wet metal, fatigue, 5 hours of heat, and a grip that had nothing left. She fell roughly 20 feet onto a travertine ledge near the base of the falls. The impact was direct and vertical. The ascending hiker shouted and began descending toward her. Jessamine's partner, hearing the commotion from the top, looked over the edge but could not see the ledge from above. Hikers at the base of the falls reached her within minutes. Emergency communication required a satellite messenger carried by another group. A helicopter medical team reached the site roughly 90 minutes later. Jessamine showed no signs of life. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be catastrophic cranial trauma with cervical spine fractures consistent with vertical impact onto rock. Contributing factors included prolonged exertion in heat and reduced grip capacity on mineral-coated surfaces. The Tribal Land Management Authority installed warning signage at the descent point. Her hiking partner published blog entry number 22, the one Jessamine never finished. The stopwatch on her phone was still running when they recovered her belongings. I don't know why that detail hit me so hard, but it did.
It was November 8, 2014, at a remote section of the Grand Canyon's south rim, roughly 2 miles from the nearest maintained overlook. The limestone face at the rim edge dropped approximately 140 feet to a wide inner canyon shelf. No other visitors were present. The only sound was wind moving across open rock. Ferris Delahousse was 29 and worked as an auto body technician in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He had no hiking or climbing background, but was comfortable working with mechanical systems and rigging in the shop. He had driven to the Grand Canyon with a co-worker for a weekend of day hiking, bringing along a rappel setup he had built himself. Co-workers later told investigators he had spent several weeks assembling and testing the rig after hours, running rope over an overhead beam in the shop, and hanging from a harness made from nylon webbing to check his knots and friction setup. He told them he planned to find a place at the canyon worth roping down to. The system consisted of 200 feet of braided nylon utility rope purchased from a hardware store and the homemade webbing harness. At the rim, Ferris chose a juniper tree with exposed roots as his anchor point. Ferris wrapped the rope around the trunk, rigged his friction setup, and leaned his full body weight back to test the anchor. The tree flexed slightly, but held. He stepped over the rim and began lowering himself down the limestone face while his co-worker watched from above, the rope sliding across the bark of the juniper. About 30 feet below the rim, Ferris paused to adjust his grip and reposition his feet along a shallow seam in the rock. His co-worker later told investigators the rope had begun cutting deeper into the bark as Ferris shifted his weight below. A few seconds later, he heard a dry cracking sound from the direction of the tree. The juniper tilted forward slightly. Loose soil shifted around its exposed roots. Before Ferris could climb back up the rope, the anchor failed. The root mass tore free from the rim in a single motion, the entire juniper pitching forward over the edge. Ferris dropped the remaining distance to the inner shelf below. The rope and the uprooted tree followed immediately behind him, along with a spray of loose dirt and rock dislodged from the rim. The co-worker lost sight of him as the fall disappeared below the edge. Emergency services were contacted within minutes. Park rangers and a technical rescue team descended by rope from the rim to reach the inner shelf where Ferris had landed. He was found unresponsive, and paramedics confirmed fatal head and thoracic trauma consistent with a high-velocity fall. Investigators later determined the juniper anchor had failed because erosion on the downslope face had left the root system embedded in loose, unconsolidated soil. While the tree held during the initial lean test, the sustained loading from the rappel caused the weakened roots to pull free from the rim. The Land Management Authority installed no rappelling signage at that section of rim within 2 months. At the shop where Ferris had tested the rig, co-workers later noticed scuff marks still visible on the overhead beam he had used during his practice runs. It was April 18th, 2015. Along a remote section of the Grand Canyon's south rim, a limestone edge jutted over a 400-foot vertical drop into the canyon below, and Tyler Cassian was about to perform his last stunt. The engagement party had been going smoothly until the 26-year-old decided the weathered rock would make a perfect stage for what he did best. Tyler had built a modest following in Las Vegas, performing urban parkour. His social media showed him vaulting concrete barriers, scaling parking garages, and jumping between rooftops in the downtown arts district. He worked nights as a casino floor supervisor, training during the day at a local gymnastics facility where he'd refined his technique for 3 years. Friends described him as confident to the point of reckless, someone who never turned down a physical challenge. He'd driven up from Vegas specifically for his college roommate's engagement celebration, arriving that morning with his signature wrist guards and grip-enhanced shoes. Tyler had no experience with natural terrain. His world was concrete, metal, and predictable surfaces. The Grand Canyon's south rim is carved from Kaibab limestone, a sedimentary rock that weathers unevenly, creating deceptive footholds and surfaces that can crumble without warning under sudden pressure. The private gathering of 18 guests had just finished the engagement toast when Tyler spotted a gap between two rock formations roughly 8 feet apart, positioned directly above the sheer drop. The morning dew hadn't fully evaporated, leaving a thin moisture layer on the stone that wasn't immediately visible. A bridesmaid, in a coral dress, stood 12 feet away, champagne glass still in hand. As Tyler announced he wanted to show everyone something cool, he didn't test the surface, didn't check for loose rock or grip quality. Tyler simply backed up 15 feet, stretched briefly, and committed to a hurried running approach toward the gap. 3 other guests had their phones out, anticipating another one of his viral-worthy performances. Tyler's approach was textbook perfect, his form identical to dozens of successful jumps captured on video back home. But limestone isn't pavement. His left foot planted on the edge for launch, and the moisture-slicked surface provided zero friction. His shoe slid outward violently, and his body pitched forward over the rim at a high but slightly cautious speed. The bridesmaid's scream cut through the celebration as Tyler disappeared. His body struck a couple of protruding rock formations during the initial descent, each impact breaking additional bones and tearing tissue. His trajectory was unpredictable, and he finally came to rest on a narrow ledge about 200 feet below the rim, wedged between some boulders. Multiple people at the party called 911. Park rangers reached the remote section of the south rim 18 minutes later, carefully making their way along a narrow maintenance trail. From the rim, they could see Tyler's body resting on a ledge far below. The medical examiner's report documented massive blunt force trauma to the chest and head, multiple fractured vertebrae, and severe internal hemorrhaging. Death likely occurred within seconds of the first impact. The engagement party disbanded quietly. Most guests left within the hour. The celebration irreversibly shattered. Park officials recovered Tyler's specialized parkour shoes and wrist guards from his body, meaning that he had likely planned a stunt in advance. The incident was logged in the park's records as an accidental death by fall, one of several fatal falls reported along the canyon's rims that year. Tyler's family declined to speak publicly about the tragedy.
It was the 9th of June, 2017 at the Grand Canyon in Arizona. The weather was warm and hundreds of visitors had arrived early to explore the South Rim. Harvey Idris was 27 years old and lived in Denver, Colorado. He worked as an insurance adjuster and was an experienced marathon runner. Running was a major part of his life, and he took pride in his endurance and discipline. A few months earlier, Harvey had entered a marathon but finished behind another runner named Kyle. Afterward, Kyle often talked about his intense training routines, claiming he ran steep mountain trails, trained in extreme heat, and completed workouts in remote areas. Harvey never challenged those stories. Hearing them bothered him. He felt people admired Kyle not just for winning, but for being tougher than everyone else. And I think that's the part that really stuck with Harvey. Losing a race is one thing. Feeling like somebody is tougher than you is something else entirely.
In the weeks that followed, Harvey became focused on proving something to himself.
He wanted a challenge that would be harder than a marathon and more demanding than anything he had done before. That was when he started reading about the Grand Canyon. The South Rim route immediately caught his attention, and he convinced himself that the canyon would simply be a tougher version of a marathon he would be able to handle. His friend warned him that the canyon was completely different from a road race. The steep elevation changes, the heat, and the dry air could wear people down much faster than expected. The friend urged him to carry water, glucose packets, and emergency supplies. Harvey refused. He pointed out that he had completed long races before without hydration stops, and believed carrying extra supplies would only slow him down.
Now this is the part of the story where I started shaking my head like, oh God, a marathon has aid stations, but a canyon does not. Those are two very different environments.
On the morning of June 9th, Harvey arrived at the Grand Canyon alone. He parked near the south rim and prepared to begin his run. He carried very little with him. He brought no water, no energy supplements, and no emergency equipment. He intended to finish the route and return to his car the same day. At first, everything seemed normal. Harvey settled into a steady pace and moved comfortably along the trail. The morning air felt manageable, and the run began much the way he expected. As the hours passed, conditions changed. The temperature climbed higher. The dry air pulled moisture from his body with every mile. The steep climbs demanded far more energy than he had anticipated. Unlike an organized marathon, there were no aid stations and no crowds cheering runners forward. Harvey continued running despite becoming increasingly dehydrated. Several miles down one of the South Rim trails, he noticed the heat becoming far more intense than it had been that morning. His throat felt dry and he realized he was sweating heavily, but he convinced himself the discomfort was temporary and kept moving. And this is the point where I wish someone had been there to tell him to stop. His pace slowed and simple sections of the trail became difficult. Eventually, he left the main trail and moved toward a small shaded area. He sat down, intending to rest for a few minutes before continuing. Instead, his condition continued to deteriorate. Without water or any way to cool down, the heat and dehydration took a severe toll on his body. Alone and far from assistance, Harvey never made it back to the trail. His friend expected to hear from him that evening, but no message arrived. By the second day, concern turned into alarm, and park authorities were contacted. Rangers searched the canyon and eventually found Harvey dead near the shaded area where he had stopped to rest. Investigators determined that severe dehydration and heat-related illness had led to his death. Harvey believed endurance alone would carry him through the canyon. In the end, the canyon demanded something he never brought with him, which is water. It was the 28th of May 2018 when the Grand Canyon swallowed another person whole, not because it was malicious, not because it was unpredictable, but because someone arrived at its edge believing the gap between ambition and ability was smaller than it actually was. Benny Fisk was 22 years old and had traveled from Australia to build something. He ran a climbing channel with fewer than 5,000 subscribers, a number that had flatlined for months despite consistent uploads. He had started framing safety equipment as performance, as theater, as something that dulled the honesty of what he was trying to show. That framing worried the people closest to him, and they said so. He kept filming anyway. He entered the backcountry that morning with one companion, a friend, acting as a spotter, carrying water and spare camera batteries. The plan communicated to the spotter was a rehearsal session. Now, this was according to the spotter's statement. He could have just been lying in the aftermath to avoid fault. Benny said he wanted to walk through movement sequences on the lower wall. At some point before reaching the base, he mounted a chest camera without mentioning it. The spotter later told rangers he had no indication Benny intended to climb unroped. The base of the wall showed fresh debris from a recent rockfall, pale fragments scattered across the talus, edges still sharp, dust that hadn't yet been weathered back into the rock's color. It was the kind of detail an experienced climber reads immediately. A limestone formation that has recently shed material is telling you something specific about what it's willing to hold. Benny stepped over the debris and started up. The chest camera footage, recovered intact, showed him roughly 30 feet above the talus when he found the flake, a pale slab jutting outward from the main wall, wide enough to grip with both hands. He tested it with his fingertips. The footage showed him shifting his full body weight onto it. The slab did not crack. There was a faint hollow response under load, almost imperceptible in the audio, before the entire section peeled outward in a single motion. The spotter, positioned roughly 80 feet back, witnessed the fall without obstruction. He later described Benny's arms spreading outward as the rock gave way, his body rotating backward through open air in a slow, silent arc. Benny's left shoulder contacted the cliff face approximately 15 feet below the point of failure, with a brief scraping rebound that redirected his body inward toward the wall before he continued downward. The spotter said he heard the landing before he fully processed what he was seeing. He said it did not sound like what he expected. The chest camera's audio track recorded irregular wet respiratory sounds for approximately 10 seconds after impact before the file went silent. The spotter activated a satellite messenger immediately. A Park Service helicopter reached the site 51 minutes later from a nearby staging area, already active with backcountry operations. Benny was pronounced dead at the scene. No resuscitation was attempted. In the weeks after, parts of the climbing community quietly questioned the consistency of the spotter's account, especially the claim that he had no awareness of an unroped descent until it was already underway, and honestly, I'm actually with them.
Although there was no evidence to confirm deception, the gaps in timing and communication were enough for some to suspect the story had been shaped to protect himself as much as to explain what happened. His family requested the removal of his channel within a month.
It was July 28, 2017, and dark monsoon clouds stacked in towering columns south of the Grand Canyon's south rim, their bases flat and bruised purple against the plateau as humidity pressed down through thin air at 7,000 feet. Sigrid Bjornstad was 44 years old and had coached cross-country and track at a high school in central Minnesota for 14 years, producing competitive distance runners from a school of fewer than 400 students. Colleagues described a coach who built her reputation on toughness, a philosophy rooted in the flat farmland, where Minnesota storms rolled in visibly from 30 miles away and usually veered south or dissolved before reaching the practice fields. That July, Sigrid had organized a voluntary preseason conditioning trip to Arizona. 4 graduating seniors who had turned 18 that spring and 2 assistant coaches. Not an official school activity. The group had spent 2 days running at lower elevations near Sedona before driving north to the South Rim for their final morning. Sigrid's plan was a group jog along the paved Rim Trail, a flat, scenic path following the canyon edge through exposed sections and areas with stone overlook structures. The group began shortly after 8, warm, humid, clear overhead. The dark cloud mass to the south was visible from the trailhead. One assistant coach, raised in Tucson, pointed it out and suggested keeping the run short. Sigrid glanced at the clouds and told the group they looked mean but never delivered. 2 of the seniors later confirmed she said it twice, once at the trailhead and once roughly 20 minutes into the jog. It was the same phrase she used every time a storm built over the practice fields back home. And that's the thing that makes this one cut different from the others. She wasn't ignoring the warning. She genuinely read the sky the way she'd read it for 14 years. The sky just worked differently here, and no one corrected her in time. 40 minutes in, the first thunder echoed across the canyon, deep and close. The assistant coach from Tucson immediately called for the group to turn back. Sigrid was at the front of the loose formation, on a fully flat, exposed section of paved trail. No stone structures, no trees, no shelter of any kind within immediate reach. The nearest covered overlook sat roughly 200 feet behind her, where 3 of the runners had already slowed near the structure. The 2 assistant coaches and the 4th runner were between Sigrid and the shelter, spread across 50 feet of trail. The sky darkened rapidly. No rain fell. The thunder was closer now, rolling directly overhead instead of echoing from the south. A single bolt struck the exposed section of trail. Sigrid was on open, flat ground with no cover, roughly 50 feet ahead of the nearest person. The 2 assistant coaches closest to her position later described a blinding white flash and an immediate concussive sound that knocked one of them sideways. When their vision cleared, Sigrid was on the ground. The 3 runners near the overlook had dropped to the pavement at the sound. The assistant coach from Tucson reached her within 30 seconds. She was unresponsive, not breathing, no pulse. He began CPR immediately. The other assistant coach ran toward the nearest developed area to reach Park Dispatch. An entrance burn was visible on Sigrid's right shoulder. An exit burn had split open the sole of her left running shoe. From shoulder to shoe, that's the path the bolt took through her. I spent a while looking at that detail in the examiner's notes, and I still don't fully know how to process it. No other member of the group was injured. Park rangers arrived within 12 minutes. Advanced life support was initiated and unsuccessful. Sigrid was pronounced dead on the trail. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be cardiac arrest, resulting from direct lightning strike, with secondary electrical entrance and exit burns. The bolt's path through her torso was consistent with immediate and irreversible disruption of cardiac rhythm. The school district implemented mandatory weather monitoring and lightning safety protocols for all off-campus athletic activities, including voluntary trips. The Park Service reviewed lightning shelter spacing along the most exposed rim sections, noting no covered structure existed within 200 feet of where Sigrid was struck. Her team dedicated the fall cross-country season in her name.
It was August 23, 2016. A narrow tributary canyon branched off the Grand Canyon's main drainage corridor. Ochre and rust-colored walls rising 90 feet on both sides, framing a flat, sandy wash roughly 8 feet wide. Faint horizontal staining marked the lower rock surfaces at varying heights. The air inside was still and hot. Cassia Trentholm was 38 years old and worked as an elementary school science teacher in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She had spent 11 years teaching earth science and weather units to middle schoolers across the district. She was on a solo day hike to document sedimentary layering, visible only in the lower drainage walls of this tributary, a trip planned months in advance. Colleagues later described her as deeply confident in her understanding of desert weather systems, someone who trusted her academic background to keep her ahead of conditions that caught less informed hikers off guard. Earlier that morning, on the main trail, Cassia had stopped to explain cloud formations to a couple she'd just met, pointing at the building cumulus over the plateau, naming the cloud categories, and telling them she could read from the formation that any storm was at least 4 hours out. The couple later gave statements to investigators confirming the conversation and the timeline. A flash flood warning sign was posted at the main trailhead, roughly half a mile from the tributary entrance. No barriers blocked the tributary mouth. A day hiker near the tributary entrance later told investigators he had a clear sightline roughly 600 feet into the narrow canyon. He could see Cassia crouching near the far rock face. He described hearing a low rumble from the plateau direction. Beginning as a vibration, he felt more than heard before rising to a sustained roar within seconds. He watched a wall of brown water and debris fill the canyon behind Cassia's position, approaching rapidly from deeper in the tributary and filling the full width of the wash. He watched her stand and turn up canyon toward the sound. She moved immediately to the nearest wall, hands searching the surface, shifting along the base. The walls were smooth, the same polished limestone that had produced the horizontal staining on the lower surfaces. He could see no features on either side that would allow a person to climb above the water line. The water reached her within seconds. The full force of the drainage funneled through the 8-foot wide wash with no room to dissipate. She was swept off her feet and carried toward the mouth. The day hiker scrambled to higher ground as floodwater, carrying branches, rock fragments, and dense sediment, discharged violently from the canyon mouth into the main corridor. He called emergency services immediately. Recovery teams located Cassia's body 1.3 miles downstream the following day. Her notebook, recovered from debris, confirmed she had been documenting strata, the final entry, an incomplete sketch. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be drowning with contributing blunt force trauma to the head and upper body consistent with debris impact. Meteorological data confirmed a storm cell had developed 14 miles northwest over the plateau, entirely outside visual range from inside the tributary. Plateau runoff channels into isolated drainages and arrives at canyon floor level with little warning until seconds before water reaches a given position. The Trail Authority installed prominent flash flood warning signage at the tributary entrance the following season. It was May 22, 2015. The Colorado River carved through the inner canyon, its deceptively smooth surface hiding forces that had claimed lives since humans first dared navigate these waters. James Whitford, a 45-year-old ET specialist from Sacramento, stood at the river's edge, watching sunlight dance across what appeared to be calm water. Within minutes, the river would prove him fatally wrong. James wasn't new to rivers. He'd spent weekends kayaking California's gentler waterways and had completed a handful of guided rafting trips on Class 2 and 3 rapids. Friends described him as confident, sometimes overconfident, with a tendency to dismiss safety briefings as overly cautious. He'd joined a commercial rafting expedition through the Grand Canyon, attracted by the adventure but dismissive of the river's reputation. His wife had encouraged the trip, hoping it would break his monotonous work routine managing network servers for a regional healthcare company. That morning, the group had pulled into a sandy beach along the river after navigating several moderate rapids. James had handled the morning runs well enough, though his guide noticed he frequently second-guessed instructions. During the lunch break, their guide warned the group not to enter the water in certain sections, where hydraulic holes can trap swimmers in a violent recirculating current that repeatedly drags them underwater. They said that James listened, but seemed unimpressed. The guide had stepped roughly 25 feet away to check a snapped raft line, leaving James temporarily unsupervised. James spotted a section that looked mirror smooth from shore. He removed his life jacket, placing it deliberately on a rock, and stripped down to swim shorts. Two rafters from his group watched, but didn't intervene, assuming he knew what he was doing. James waded in confidently, the water initially only waist deep. He pushed forward, beginning to swim with strong, practiced strokes. Within 5 strokes, everything changed. The current, moving at nearly 8 miles per hour beneath the calm surface, grabbed him like a powerful hydraulic force, spinning his body in violent turbulence. A fellow rafter named Sarah estimated he traveled roughly 180 feet in about 10 seconds. James's head went under, then resurfaced briefly as he was swept toward a hydraulic hole near the bend. The recirculating feature caught him instantly. His body spun violently, disappearing beneath churning white water, reappearing seconds later in a grotesque tumble, then vanishing again. The hydraulic held him in its grip, rotating him through the churning cycle, like laundry in a washing machine. Sarah screamed for the guide, who reached the shore in time to see James's body surface one final time, face down, arms limp, before the current released him and swept him around the bend. The guide used a commercial VHF radio. Dispatch acknowledged the call at 1:49 p.m., and a Park Service call-out was authorized by 2:10 p.m. 2 rafters launched a kayak in pursuit. They hesitated briefly because of the turbulence, but followed the body's trajectory downstream, unable to reach it before it disappeared into the canyon's next section. Park Service rescue teams mobilized within 30 minutes, deploying search crews along the river corridor. Recovery operations continued for 3 days, hampered by the river's icy temperature, high flow, and complex canyon terrain. James's body was located 2 miles downstream on May 25th, wedged against submerged rocks in a shallow eddy. The medical examiner's report listed drowning as cause of death, with multiple blunt force trauma injuries consistent with violent water turbulence and repeated impact with submerged rocks. Estimated time of death was within 5 minutes of entering the water. The rafting company issued internal safety protocol reminders, but faced no legal action, as James had violated explicit instructions. Park rangers later posted additional warnings along the river corridor about the dangers of swimming in fast-moving sections of the Colorado River.
It was the morning of September 16th, 2014, at the Grand Canyon in Arizona. Visitors stood along the overlooks, taking photographs and admiring the dramatic cliffs that dropped sharply into the canyon below. Zinnia Finnegan was 29 years old and lived in Phoenix, Arizona. She worked as a sales assistant and loved spending her free time outdoors. Whenever she traveled, she took photographs and recorded videos to share online with friends and family.
Over time, she became interested in creating content that looked different from the thousands of travel videos posted every day.
She enjoyed finding unusual locations and ideas that would make her videos stand out from everyone else doing the same thing. Let me be sincere here. If you've ever posted photos or videos online, you've probably felt the temptation to do something a little different from everyone else. The problem is that different and safe don't always go together. During a trip to the Grand Canyon with several friends, Zinnia spent the morning exploring viewpoints and taking photographs. While walking along the south rim, she noticed a narrow rock formation sitting beyond the main viewing area. From a distance, the formation appeared to extend out over the canyon, and people standing on it looked completely exposed, with open air on both sides and nothing stable beneath them for a significant drop below. Zinnia immediately liked the idea. She thought the formation would make an impressive video. Her friends were less enthusiastic. They pointed out that the rock looked uneven and completely exposed, and reminded her that visitors were expected to stay inside the designated viewing areas. One of them said plainly that a single wrong step near that edge would leave no room for recovery. Zinnia believed they were worrying too much and said she would only be out there for a few moments.
Whenever I hear multiple people warning someone about the exact same thing, I pay attention. It's easy to dismiss one concerned person, it's harder to dismiss several.
Then she made it more complicated. Earlier that morning, she had bought a small woven basket from one of the gift shops near the entrance. Standing there looking at the formation, she decided the video would be more interesting if she balanced the basket on her head while crossing the rock. Her friends went quiet for a moment before pushing back harder than before. They told her to forget the whole thing and come back to the viewing area. Zinnia laughed and told them she had good balance and had walked uneven trails plenty of times before. She left the designated area and climbed onto the formation while one of her friends recorded on a phone. And once the camera started rolling, I think the chances of her backing out dropped dramatically. For the first several seconds, everything looked fine. Zinnia moved carefully across the rock with the basket sitting on top of her head, smiling toward the camera as she went. The surface narrowed. The further out she walked and the ground dropped away sharply below the canyon, runs roughly a mile deep in places, and the terrain beneath her consisted of cliffs and rock shelves with no flat ground anywhere, near the base of the formation. Her attention was split 3 ways at once between where she was placing her feet, keeping the basket level, and staying aware of where the camera was.
As she approached the outer section of the formation, she made a small sideways adjustment to stop the basket from sliding.
Her foot came down slightly wrong on the uneven rock surface. She suddenly lost her balance and tried to recover, but there was nowhere safe to step. She stumbled once near the edge and disappeared from sight. Emergency services were called by witnesses, and rangers quickly responded. The area was secured, but due to the height of the fall, there was nothing rescuers could do. Zinnia Finnegan was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators found no equipment failure or weather-related factors. The accident was attributed to a series of decisions that morning. Leaving the designated viewing area, stepping onto an exposed rock formation above a sheer drop, balancing an object on her head, and ignoring repeated warnings from her friends.
It was the 9th of November 2015, along a dry wash cutting through the Kanab Creek wilderness. 2 men were camped there that night. By morning, only one walked out. Justin Mays was 45 and worked security at a warehouse distribution facility outside Calgary. He hunted once a year with relatives on annual trips south, not a specialist, not a novice, just someone who showed up reliably. He owned his 30-30, the way a lot of casual hunters do, stored carefully, handled occasionally, but not maintained with the discipline the tool actually demands. Earlier that evening, he and his cousin had found mountain lion tracks pressed into the soft soil near the creek bank, large, recent, and close to the tent site. Justin had been visibly shaken. He began cycling the lever action repeatedly while they talked, short-stroking the lever action cycle under stress, running the action the way anxious people handle objects they don't know what else to do with. I think most people bored in that dark would have reached for the rifle too. Inside the tent, Justin decided to clean the rifle before bed. His cousin told him directly to fully empty the magazine tube and visually inspect the chamber first. Based on investigations, Justin cycled the action inconsistently and likely failed to perform a direct visual and physical chamber check before assuming it was clear. 1 round remained seated in the chamber. He did not verify what he could not see. Likely believing the rifle was unloaded, he pressed the trigger while attempting to lower the hammer using improper handling under the assumption the chamber was empty after the partial cycles. The rifle discharged. His cousin described the concussion as a pressure more than a sound, something that filled the enclosed space entirely and left both men instantly deaf. The round struck Justin high in the inner thigh before punching through the nylon tent wall and disappearing into the darkness outside. His cousin turned, and the blood was already there, spreading fast across the sleeping bag and onto the gear near the door as Justin pressed both hands against the wound. Justin screamed once. After that, he was quiet but still moving, shifting his weight, pressing down, clawing at the entry point. I've read about femoral wounds before, and the speed of blood loss at that location is not something most people can prepare for. His cousin stripped off his belt and worked it above the wound as a tourniquet, then activated the emergency beacon. Within minutes, Justin's color had changed. He became pale and stopped responding to direct questions before losing consciousness entirely. A rescue helicopter was dispatched, but could not land due to terrain. It arrived overhead, 74 minutes after beacon activation, paramedics hiked in on foot and confirmed death at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be exsanguination resulting from a single gunshot wound to the upper inner thigh, consistent with complete transection of the femoral artery, no equipment malfunction. No defect in the firearm. The mechanism functioned exactly as designed. His cousin cooperated fully with investigators and gave a complete account. I'm actually glad that no charges were filed because it could have been easy to put the blame on the cousin. The site was documented and cleared. His cousin did everything a person could do once the rifle went off tourniquet. Beacon stayed present. 74 minutes was just too long. The femoral artery doesn't give that kind of time. Not in a canyon, not at night. What happened that evening wasn't negligence in the broad sense. It was one incomplete step in a sequence that almost everyone gets away with until someone doesn't.
It was March 15th, 2019, and pale morning light crept down the limestone switchbacks of a canyon trail as a line of 10 mules plodded single file toward the canyon floor, their hooves scuffing loose gravel on a path barely 8 feet wide with a wrangler leading at the front and another trailing at the rear. The ride was operated by a small, permitted outfitter that had been running guided mule trips into the canyon for over 2 decades. Garson Thibault was 62 years old and had spent 34 years delivering mail along the same rural route outside Lafayette, Louisiana, retiring just 3 months earlier. His daughter Colette, 34, had booked the mule ride as a retirement gift, a surprise she revealed at his farewell party in front of the entire post office staff. Garson smiled and thanked her. He never mentioned that the thought of riding an animal along a cliff edge made his stomach drop. He had avoided heights his entire adult life, ladders, overpasses, even the upper deck of the football stadium in Baton Rouge. He had never told anyone. The outfitter's pre-ride screening required riders to disclose any physical limitations or discomfort with heights. Garson answered no to every question. Colette stood beside him at the desk, and that's the detail that kills me, because the screening existed. The question was asked. He just couldn't answer it honestly with her standing right there. Wranglers assigned him a mule near the center of the string, 5th of 10, with Colette riding 3 positions ahead. Other riders later told investigators that Garson gripped the saddle horns so tightly, his knuckles turned white from the moment the mule stepped onto the trail. Each time Colette looked back, he released his grip and gave a stiff, controlled wave. One rider behind him observed this pattern repeating multiple times within the first 20 minutes. The rear wrangler noticed and called out reminders to sit back and loosen his grip, but the spacing between riders limited how quickly she could reach him. As the group approached a switchback roughly 45 minutes in, the trail narrowed and bent sharply back on itself. The inside wall sat within arm's reach, while the outer edge dropped toward a steep, rocky slope several hundred feet below, with no railing or barrier. The mules ahead moved through without hesitation, following the inside line. Garson's mule did the same, but Garson did not trust it. On the switchback, Garson's posture changed visibly. He leaned hard toward the wall, pulling the reins tight against his chest, the opposite of the relaxed position wranglers had demonstrated. His mule halted and balked, refusing to move with the erratic weight shifting on its back. The rider behind called out to the rear wrangler, and this is where everything speeds up, because what happens next takes less than 5 seconds. Before the rear wrangler could push forward past the riders between them, Garson attempted to dismount, shifting his weight abruptly and uncontrolled off the saddle. His left boot caught in the stirrup, and the uneven shift pulled him sideways over the mule's flank, sending him off the outer edge of the trail. The terrain below the switchback was not a sheer cliff. It was a steep, uneven slope of loose scree and fractured rock angled at roughly 50 degrees. Garson tumbled down the slope, his body striking rock surfaces at irregular intervals, limbs catching on outcroppings that redirected his trajectory but did not stop his momentum. The rider directly behind him watched the entire descent. She later described the sound, rock breaking loose with each impact, growing fainter as the distance increased. Dust rose in a visible trail behind him. The mule remained motionless on the trail. Colette, 3 positions ahead and around the bend, did not see the fall. She later told investigators she heard shouting, but assumed a mule had stumbled. She did not learn what happened until the lead wrangler halted the string and walked back to her position. Rangers later reported she had to be physically prevented from attempting to descend the slope herself. From the reports I went through, she didn't stop trying to get past them until they told her he was already gone. The rear wrangler radioed park dispatch immediately. Emergency responders reached the slope within 40 minutes using a technical rope team. Garson was located roughly 180 feet below the trail, unresponsive, wedged against a rock shelf. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be multiple blunt force trauma injuries, including bilateral rib fractures, severe traumatic brain injury, and internal hemorrhaging, consistent with repeated impacts across the slope. The outfitter suspended operations for 3 months, pending a safety review. It was the first rider fatality in the company's history. Colette established a memorial scholarship fund for rural postal carriers through a workers' association in Lafayette.
It was October 17th, 2013. Late afternoon light was already fading from the lower switchbacks of Bright Angel Trail. The canyon's layered walls pushed shadow deep into the corridor hours before sunset reached the south rim above, and the temperature dropped noticeably with every 100 feet of depth. Stellan Krug was 57 years old and had spent 28 years as a postal carrier in Denver, Colorado, walking residential foot routes in every season. He was nearing retirement. His wife later told investigators he had never considered himself a hiker. But in 28 years of walking, he had also never encountered a route his legs couldn't handle. He was visiting the canyon for the first time on a long weekend. That afternoon, he had been walking the paved South Rim Trail when he passed the Bright Angel Trailhead and decided on impulse to descend a short distance before driving back to his motel. He carried one partially full water bottle, no food, no headlamp, no map, and a light jacket. His phone had not been fully charged that day, later confirmed through device forensics. Trail signage at the trailhead warned against descending without adequate water, food, and a light source. He called his wife from the trailhead before descending. She later told investigators he said he was going just a little way down and would be back before dinner. She recognized the phrasing immediately. He used it every time a short walk turned into 3 hours. Stellan descended roughly 1.5 miles before reaching a small rest area along the trail. By then, the canyon walls had already swallowed most of the daylight. The switchbacks below were fading into shadow. He turned around and began the climb back toward the rim. Within minutes, the trail interior grew far darker than the rim above. Switchbacks carved into the rock face began blending into the surrounding terrain. At one of those turns, roughly 1 mile below the trailhead, Stellan stepped off the established path. Boot impressions later showed where his route continued onto a nearby slope that appeared to angle upward toward the rim. The ground ahead rose and fell in shallow ridges and drainage channels. In darkness, that terrain can feel like steady uphill progress even while gradually losing elevation. The tracks continued across the slope for an extended distance. His phone, later recovered from the site, had powered off earlier that evening after the battery depleted, leaving him without a light source. Eventually, the boot impressions stopped. Stellan's final position was found approximately 380 feet below the point where he had left the trail, more than 1 mile to the east in the canyon's inner drainage terrain. By then, he was alone in complete darkness, with no light, no communication, and only a light jacket intended for the warmer temperatures on the rim. His wife contacted the Park Service when he failed to return by 10 that evening. Search teams deployed immediately, but nighttime off-trail operations in that terrain were not feasible. His body was located the following morning, seated with his back against a rock where his boot impressions ended. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be hypothermia, with contributing severe dehydration. Overnight temperatures in the drainage dropped into the low 40s, consistent with weather station data. No traumatic injuries were found, no fall, no impact. He stopped walking and the temperature killed him. Investigators confirmed his route traveled consistently away from the rim. The canyon's layered drainage topography disrupts spatial orientation in darkness, making perceived uphill movement an unreliable navigation reference. The Trail Authority added explicit light source advisory language to Bright Angel Trailhead signage within the month. His wife gave an interview to a regional hiking safety publication several months later. She asked only that people charge their phones before going for a walk. It was April 22nd, 2017. The south rim of the Grand Canyon stretched under cloudless Arizona skies, concealing dangers that would claim a life before the day ended. Paul Detweiler, a 39-year-old insurance adjuster from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, stood at the edge of an unmarked trail, his brand new hiking boots still stiff from the box he'd opened 2 days earlier. Paul wasn't an experienced hiker. His outdoors resume consisted of forum posts claiming expertise and a few YouTube videos he'd watched the night before. Friends described him as overconfident, the type who researched topics online, then proclaimed himself knowledgeable. He discovered an unofficial overlook mentioned on hiking forums, where users repeatedly warned about unstable ledges and dangerous conditions requiring technical climbing gear. Paul apparently dismissed these warnings, posting that he could handle it without ropes like a pro. His only preparation was reading internet threads and packing a backpack with water and snacks. The backpack weighed approximately 28 pounds and contained no safety equipment. That morning, Paul began his descent along a narrow limestone ledge, approximately 250 feet below the rim. The Grand Canyon's layered rock formations drop 6,000 feet in places, with sedimentary limestone particularly prone to crumbling under pressure. His untested boots pinched with every step as he navigated the roughly 250-foot-long ledge carrying his overweight pack. An experienced backcountry hiker moving along the canyon wall noticed Paul immediately, observing his reckless movements with growing concern. Paul hopped over loose rocks without testing them, occasionally pressing footholds with one finger before committing his full weight. The ledge gradually narrowed from 2 feet to barely 7 inches wide, forcing him to lean outward with his back against the canyon wall. The backcountry hiker watched as Paul paused at the narrowest section, appearing to force a nervous chuckle about living on the edge, before continuing forward along the crumbling path. Likely realizing he'd reached a dead end, Paul attempted to reverse course on the 7-inch ledge. His stiff, unbroken-in boots had no flexibility, the rigid soles unable to feel the polished limestone beneath them. His right foot slipped first, the boot's tread finding no purchase on the smooth rock surface worn down by centuries of wind and water erosion. Paul's arm shot out instinctively, grabbing at the canyon wall. The soft limestone crumbled under his fingers like chalk, offering no hold. His left foot kicked frantically, trying to regain the ledge, but the weight of his backpack pitched him backward into empty air. For 6 full seconds, Paul fell through open space, his body rotating head over heels as gravity accelerated him toward the rocks below. The backcountry hiker heard one sharp shout, then nothing. Paul's body tumbled violently, limbs flailing unnaturally as he fell through open space. He impacted a jagged projection, approximately 200 feet down, the sound echoing across the canyon like a gunshot. His body continued rolling another 50 feet before coming to rest on a narrow shelf. The backcountry hiker immediately radioed park rangers at 11:47 in the morning. The technical rescue team arrived in approximately 40 minutes, rappelling down with ropes and medical equipment. Paul showed no signs of life upon first assessment. The medical examiner's report listed massive blunt force trauma to the head and chest, multiple compound fractures throughout the body, and catastrophic internal bleeding as causes of death. Time of death was estimated at 11:46 in the morning, within seconds of impact. Recovery operations took 4 hours as rangers carefully extracted Paul's body using rope systems. His family was notified that evening. Park officials used the incident to reinforce warnings about unmarked trails and the critical importance of proper equipment and training.
It was the morning of June 11th, 2018 at the Grand Canyon in Arizona. The sun had already begun warming the rocky landscape as hikers and runners set out along the trails. Zeph Marcus Quillan was 63 years old and lived in Colorado Springs, Colorado. He had spent most of his career working as a building contractor before retiring. Friends described him as hardworking and dependable, someone who rarely sat still for long. 3 years before the trip, his wife had died after a long battle with cancer. Before her health had deteriorated too much to travel, the couple had taken one final trip together to the Grand Canyon, a place she had always loved. He watched her sit for hours looking out across the canyon without ever growing tired of the view. After her death, Zeph stayed close to home for a long time and rarely traveled.
As the years passed, he slowly began revisiting the places that had meant the most to both of them.
In the spring of 2018, he decided to return to the Grand Canyon to see the view again and remember the trip they had shared. During the visit, he booked several activities, including a guided mule ride that would take him deeper into the canyon. On the morning of June 11th, Zeph arrived at the stables and joined the tour group. Guides reviewed the safety rules before the group set off. Riders were told to remain seated properly, avoid sudden movements, and stay centered in the saddle throughout the entire ride. The group moved out along the trail, and for much of the ride, Zeph appeared relaxed. He spent much of the ride looking out toward the canyon rather than paying attention to the trail ahead. I can understand why. The views in places like this can be overwhelming. Sometimes people become so focused on what's beside them that they stop thinking about what's directly underneath them. The trail eventually reached a narrower section with steep drops beside the path. Guides reminded everyone again to remain centered. The group continued forward through a series of rocky switchbacks. At some point along that section, Zeph leaned away from the center of the saddle.
Despite the repeated safety instructions, he shifted his weight outward to get a better view of the canyon below.
His weight had shifted noticeably outward before anything happened. When his mule stepped across uneven ground moments later, the movement combined with his shifted position to catch him completely off balance. Because he was already leaning away from the center of the saddle, he had little chance to recover his balance once the mule moved beneath him. He had no time to correct himself. He slipped from the saddle and fell from the trail down the steep, rocky slope below. And that's what makes this so unsettling to me. The mistake happened before the fall. The fall was just the consequence catching up to it. The slope dropped sharply from the trail edge, and the terrain below was loose rock and uneven ground, with nothing to stop a person from continuing to fall once they left the path. Other riders immediately shouted for help and alerted the guides. Emergency personnel were contacted straight away, and rescue efforts began as quickly as possible. I always feel for the people left standing on the trail in situations like this. One moment they're enjoying the view, and the next they're watching a rescue unfold below them. The location made it difficult. The slope below the trail was steep and hard to access, and rescue teams had to work carefully to reach the area, while guides managed the remaining riders on the narrow path above. Despite those efforts, Zeph died from injuries suffered in the fall. The medical examiner recorded the cause of death as fatal traumatic injuries consistent with a fall from a canyon trail onto rocky terrain below. Investigators reviewed witness statements and guide reports. The accident occurred after he moved away from the centered riding position that guides had repeatedly instructed riders to maintain. What began as an ordinary mule ride through one of America's most famous landscapes ended in a tragic accident that claimed his life.
It was the 3rd of February 2017 on a Forest Service spur road off Desert View Drive inside a national park on Arizona's South Rim. The barrier was only half down. The frost had frozen the surface firm, and the clay beneath was already saturated. Dario Hinson, 29, and his wife Lynette, 31, were Danish travel photographers producing low-budget tourism calendars for European distribution. According to their parents, this Arizona trip was the centerpiece of their winter collection Blue Hour Canyon Light, requiring position before sunrise. They had slept in their rental SUV for 3 consecutive nights to avoid lodging costs. Now, you might think that it looks reckless. I think most would. But to them, it was likely the margin that made the project work. At 4:50 a.m., Dario turned onto an unmaintained spur road past a partially intact steel gate with faded closure signage and a bent chain barrier. One post still standing, one flat on the gravel. The road wasn't on the rental GPS. Apparently, he had found it through a geotagged travel forum photograph showing an unobstructed rim clearing half a mile in. Lynette had moved to the rear seat to sort camera equipment. She was not wearing a seatbelt. I think about the barrier being only halfway down every time I go over this story, not fully closed. That one ambiguity probably decided everything. Snowmelt had saturated the clay beneath the gravel, leaving the surface firm in appearance but soft underneath. The headlights threw flat white light across dead scrub oak and pine trunks as Dario drove deeper in. At 5:18 a.m., the dashcam captured the rest. A group of elk stepped out from the tree line and began crossing the road, before briefly pausing in the beam of the headlights at the blind curve. Dario glanced down at the GPS or the camera bag. The footage doesn't clarify, and when he looked up, the animals were directly ahead. He jerked the wheel right. The rear tires broke loose immediately. The SUV fishtailed, struck a series of weathered steel W-beam guardrails, and drove sideways through an aging guardrail. The rail did not hold. Two campers at a designated overlook roughly a quarter-mile across the canyon told investigators they heard metallic impacts echoing off the rock face below. Distinct, spaced, structural. The SUV rolled 4 times down a rubble chute. On the second rotation, the roof compressed nearly flat. Lynette, unbelted, was partially ejected through a shattered side window and pinned beneath the vehicle as it rolled again. The dashcam kept recording inverted engine steam, settling gravel, and Dario's breathing, brief and increasingly strained, before distortion and loss of clear audio within a short period under 2 minutes for only a short duration before silence. The steering column had collapsed into his chest. The campers stood at the edge for several seconds trying to locate the direction before one of them called emergency services. Rescue personnel were inserted via helicopter and lowered to the crash site, coordinating with a ground team that arrived shortly after, reaching the wreck nearly 2 hours after the initial call. Both were pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner listed Lynette's cause of death as crush trauma to the thorax and pelvis, consistent with partial ejection and rollover. Dario's as blunt chest and facial trauma with internal hemorrhage and airway compromise from the collapsed steering column. Neither death was instantaneous. I'll be direct. The barrier was the decision point. Everything after that was consequence. The memory cards were recovered and returned to Lynette's sister. 3 days of frost-covered canyon shots, none from February 3rd. I can't shake the feeling that the Grand Canyon wasn't just their subject, but a silent, indifferent judge rewarding their desperate pursuit of its beauty with an unforgiving verdict. Now, every time I picture the canyon's frozen cliffs and echoing depths, I don't see a calendar's centerpiece. I see the place where their ambition outran their judgment, and where the land itself decided the final frame. Two people who knew exactly what they were doing behind a camera, but had no idea what they were doing behind the wheel.
It was October 3rd, 2014, and narrow sandstone walls rose 80 feet on either side of a slot canyon, branching off the main gorge in a remote section of the Grand Canyon backcountry, where filtered morning light barely reached the floor, and the temperature dropped noticeably within the first 100 feet of the entrance. Auden Callister was 29 years old and worked as a dental hygienist in Cedar City, Utah. 3 evenings a week, she climbed at an indoor bouldering gym, where she had progressed quickly over 2 years. She owned a canyoneering harness, a rappel device, and a 150-foot static rope. Her regular climbing partner, a certified canyoneering guide, handled all technical rigging and carried the group's ascending gear on every trip. That weekend, they had planned to run a moderate route through the Slot Canyon. 3 rappels, the final one listed in route guides as requiring a minimum of 200 feet of rope. Her partner canceled the morning of the trip. Auden decided to go alone. She had never soloed a canyoneering route. A fellow canyoneer entering the same canyon that morning later told investigators he passed Auden at the entrance while she rigged her anchor sling. She told him her partner had bailed on what she called the easy one. He noticed her rope bag appeared smaller than what most people carried for that route, but said nothing. Auden completed the first 2 rappels without incident. The third dropped into a deep, narrow section where the canyon floor was visible more than 100 feet below. She set her anchor roughly 10 feet further back from the lip than the established rigging point, a common error that reduces the usable length of the rope, and began her descent. Roughly 90 feet down, her hands reached the end of the rope. She was suspended approximately 30 feet above the canyon floor, full weight on the harness, feet braced against damp sandstone. The stopper knot locked against her rappel device. She had no ascending device, no Prusik cord, no friction hitches. Without proper ascending equipment, climbing back up the rope was extremely difficult and could not be sustained for long. The canyon floor was visible directly below her, close enough to make out individual rocks, far enough that the fall would be unsurvivable. She tried to climb, Gouge marks from her rappel device showed she had attempted to pull herself upward on the rope using arm strength alone, gaining a few feet at most before sliding back to the same position. She tried to traverse. Boot scuff marks and chalk residue spread across a 15-foot horizontal range on the sandstone face, her feet pushing sideways, searching for a ledge, a crack, anything that could take her weight. There was nothing. The sandstone in that section was smooth and damp. Every feature she tested gave way or offered nothing to grip. I need you to sit with what that means. Suspended 30 feet up, nowhere to go, watching the light change on the canyon floor below her for what investigators estimated was 1 to 2 hours. Her legs began to fail first. The boot prints on the wall drew closer together, no longer extending fully, no longer reaching as far. Her lateral movement narrowed. The attempts to traverse stopped. The marks near the end were concentrated in a tight cluster directly below her hanging position. Small, shallow scuffs, barely indentations. She was no longer searching. She was just trying to shift her weight. Then the marks stopped entirely. Her body was discovered the following morning by a canyoneering group running the same route. She was still on the rope 30 feet above the canyon floor, slumped forward in her harness, arms hanging at her sides. The rope had not failed. The harness had not failed. She was exactly where she had been when the rope ran out. That image, still on the rope, 30 feet from the ground, with nothing broken except the math on her rope length, is the one from this entire video I can't get out of my head. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be positional asphyxia secondary to prolonged suspension in a climbing harness. As exhaustion depleted her ability to reposition, the leg loops and waist belt progressively restricted her ability to breathe until it stopped. Investigators confirmed her 150-foot rope was insufficient for the final rappel from her chosen anchor position, and that she carried none of the ascending equipment necessary to self-rescue. The Land Management Authority installed route-specific signage at the canyon entrance listing minimum rope lengths and requiring ascending gear. Her climbing gym in Cedar City held a memorial and launched an outdoor transition clinic series.
It was October 14th, 2017. Afternoon light angled low across the Grand Canyon South Rim Trail, where the path narrowed to roughly 3.5 feet between a sheer drop on one side and a vertical limestone wall on the other. A group of desert bighorn sheep, including one mature ram, rested near the trail edge. Ingrid Van Broeklen was 61 years old and had recently retired after 32 years as a dental hygienist in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She had no wilderness experience. The Grand Canyon had been on her bucket list for over a decade. This was her first visit, traveling with her adult daughter. Earlier on the trail, at a wider section, a park ranger had advised Ingrid to maintain distance when she was photographing the group from roughly 30 feet. She acknowledged the warning. The ranger continued along the rim. Over the following 20 minutes, Ingrid resumed closing the gap. 3 separate passing hikers told her to move back. She responded each time that she wasn't bothering them. Her daughter had fallen roughly 80 yards behind. She'd stopped at a wider section to rest and adjust a boot. Per the daughter's later statement, she told her mother she would catch up in a moment. Recovered footage from Ingrid's phone showed that in the final recorded segment, she was approximately 8 feet from the dominant ram, narrating a video message to her grandchildren back in Minneapolis. She described how gentle the animals looked and told them not to let anyone tell them otherwise. 2 hikers approaching from the opposite direction later told investigators they could see the ram's posture as they neared. Ears flattened, weight shifted forward onto its front legs. Ingrid stepped to her left to improve her camera angle, closing the distance to roughly 5 feet. The ram rose from its resting position. The 2 approaching hikers described the shift as immediate. Head dropped, neck stiffened, weight loaded forward. The charge covered the distance in under 2 seconds. The impact caught Ingrid at the hip and left side as she turned partially toward the trail interior. The trail width offered no lateral escape. The limestone wall to her right, the canyon dropped to her left. The force carried her over the canyon side edge. The 2 hikers called emergency services immediately. Ingrid's daughter returned to the section approximately 4 minutes later. Recovery required a technical rescue team and several hours. Ingrid was airlifted from the canyon and transported to a regional trauma center where she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death to be left-sided rib fractures with a flail segment, pelvic ring disruption, and a basilar skull fracture consistent with a fall of approximately 170 feet. Wildlife behavior consultants confirmed the ram's response was consistent with pre-rut territorial aggression. In the weeks preceding the late November rut peak, mature rams become significantly less tolerant of close approach and can escalate from rest to a full charge with minimal observable warning. Park Wildlife Management expanded mandatory approach distance signage at all identified bighorn activity zones on the rim trail. The grandchildren received a copy of the earlier trail footage from that morning per the family's request. It was October 14th, 2018. The north rim of the Grand Canyon stretched into darkness as a 32-foot rented recreational vehicle inched backward toward an unguarded cliff edge, its reverse lights casting white beams into empty air where solid ground should have been. Randy Forster, a 55-year-old insurance adjuster from Columbus, Ohio, had spent 3 decades behind a desk processing claims. His wife, Sheila, 53, worked part-time at a local credit union. Neither had ever driven anything larger than their Honda sedan before renting the RV for their anniversary trip. They chose the North Rim specifically for its reputation as less crowded than the South Rim, hoping to capture sunset photographs from Cape Royal Road's scenic pullouts despite signs at the road entrance warning that vehicles longer than 22 feet were not permitted. They arrived at the Cape Royal area just after sunset, realizing too late they'd miscalculated the drive time. Randy wanted to turn around at a narrow pullout approximately 800 feet from the main parking area rather than continue forward in unfamiliar darkness. The pullout measured roughly 40 feet wide, with no guardrails or barriers clearly marking where the pavement ended near the canyon's 200-foot drop. North Rim pullouts were designed decades earlier for standard vehicles, not modern RVs exceeding 30 feet in length. In darkness, the visual distinction between solid ground and void disappeared entirely. The RV's large blind spots made Sheila almost invisible in the mirrors until the vehicle's rear wheels were already on loose gravel. At 7:45 in the evening, Randy began his three-point turn. Sheila stood outside the passenger door, attempting to guide him, using hand signals barely visible in the RV's side mirrors. Her voice carried warnings, but Randy, plausibly concentrating on maneuvering, likely could not hear her over the engine and the wind. A motorcyclist traveling southbound stopped his bike approximately 50 feet away, keeping his headlight aimed at the scene to provide additional illumination. He later told investigators the RV's positioning concerned him immediately. Randy pulled forward, angling the vehicle's nose toward the road. He shifted into reverse, checking his passenger mirror where Sheila stood waving her arms. The rear wheels slipped instantly on loose gravel at the pullout's boundary, causing the back end to pivot downward. The ground beneath the rear wheels gave way instantly, and the vehicle's back end dropped, its frame pivoting downward at a steep angle. Sheila, standing directly behind the passenger side, had no time to move. The descending RV's rear corner struck her torso with devastating force, sweeping her over the edge. The 12,000-pound vehicle tumbled end over end down the rocky slope. Metal tore against stone, shattering windows and collapsing the roof structure. Randy instinctively braced for the turn, but his weight threw him against the disintegrating interior as the RV rolled violently. Glass shredded upholstery and flesh alike. The vehicle completed 2 full rotations before sliding another 30 feet, finally stopping on a flatter shelf 200 feet below the rim. Sheila's body came to rest 40 feet from the wreckage, wedged between 2 boulders where the initial impact had thrown her. Emergency crews from the ranger station arrived in 22 minutes, following the motorcyclist's call. Both victims were pronounced deceased at the scene. The medical examiner's report listed Randy's cause of death as multiple blunt force trauma, including severe head injuries and internal bleeding. Sheila died from massive thoracic crush injuries and traumatic asphyxiation. Her chest cavity collapsed from the RV's initial impact. Recovery crews removed the wreckage 3 days later using heavy recovery equipment. Existing advisories at the site had warned only against off-trail hiking, not oversized vehicle maneuvers. Following the incident, park officials reviewed safety signage, though no physical barriers were installed.
It was the evening of 14th August 2019 at the Grand Canyon. The temperatures had cooled after a hot day, and many visitors were still gathered along the south rim, watching the sunset over the canyon. Ellington, 52, and Jacqueline, 49, were a married couple from Albuquerque, New Mexico, who enjoyed visiting national parks together. During their trip to the Grand Canyon, they spent the day sightseeing and taking photographs. As sunset approached, they decided to take one final walk before returning to their hotel. Despite warning signs recommending water, lights, and emergency supplies, Ellington insisted they would only be gone briefly and didn't need supplies. The couple set off carrying just a small bottle of water and a single mobile phone.
I've stood at trailhead signs like that one before, and I understand the impulse to think that it doesn't apply to you, but I think they had a different experience.
Shortly after sunset, they entered the trail. At first, everything seemed straightforward. The path was easy to follow, and the cooler temperatures made walking comfortable. As darkness gradually settled over the canyon, however, visibility became increasingly limited. The flashlight on their phone illuminated only a narrow section of trail ahead of them. About 40 minutes into the hike, they reached an area where the trail switched back along a rocky slope. Jacqueline suggested turning around before it became too dark to safely navigate. Ellington disagreed. He believed they still had plenty of time and convinced her to continue. A short while later, they missed a turn and unknowingly left the maintained trail. Neither of them immediately realized what had happened. The terrain ahead still appeared walkable, and they assumed they would reconnect with the trail farther along. Instead, they found themselves moving through unfamiliar ground while darkness continued to increase around them. When they eventually realized they were lost, they faced an important choice. They could remain where they were and wait until daylight, or they could continue trying to find their way back in the dark. She had already suggested turning back once. I think about Jacqueline in that moment knowing something was wrong and not being able to change what happened next. Ellington chose to keep moving. The decision would prove fatal.
As they crossed a steep rocky section, Ellington stepped onto loose ground near the edge of a slope.
His footing gave way beneath him. He lost his balance and tumbled down the rocky incline. Jacqueline watched helplessly as his body struck rocks during the fall. He came to rest far below, badly injured and unable to move. She immediately climbed down to reach him. When she arrived, it was obvious he was badly injured. He was conscious but unable to stand or climb. The fall had left him seriously hurt and stranded far below the trail. The couple attempted to call for help, but the canyon's terrain provided little or no phone reception, and I think this is where the reality of the situation finally hit them. With darkness surrounding them and no clear route back to the trail, Jacqueline remained with her husband throughout the night. The following morning, hotel staff reported the couple missing after they failed to check out. Rangers launched a search and eventually found them below the trail. Ellington Faraday had died from injuries sustained in the fall, while Jacqueline was rescued and survived. Investigators concluded the tragedy stemmed from a series of poor decisions, including entering the canyon late in the day with minimal supplies, relying on a phone for light, and continuing after becoming lost. What began as a simple walk became a fatal accident when one mistake left no room for recovery.
This was on the 18th of September, 2018, on the eastern approach to Horseshoe Mesa, and this incident questions: would you enter a hole in the ground if the only thing telling you it was safe was a printout from 2007 Nella and Brix Cabot would have, and did? Nella and Brix were office workers from Cork, Ireland, 33 and 36, before getting married. Based on what their friends said and their online footprint, they had spent 2 years cross-referencing archived forum threads from the mid-2000s against satellite images, building a trip around sources that had not been updated in over a decade. They printed the map, sealed it in a plastic bag, and flew across the Atlantic with it. Imagine preparing for 2 years, being careful at exactly something so catastrophically wrong. Now, the site they called the Cathedral was not a cave. It was a tailless void, a hollow formed between collapsed boulders, its ceiling held not by solid rock, but but by wedged slabs of fractured limestone and interlocked debris that had been shifting incrementally over time. Neither had cave rescue training or any geology background. They carried a GoPro, 2 headlamps, snacks, and a 2007 printout. The archived posts described the location with the kind of specific confidence that reads as expertise. Nothing in those threads mentioned the ceiling instability risk or subsurface void hazards common in talus formations. The approach dropped below the mesa rim, through pinyon and juniper scrub along a faint use trail. The canyon wall above sat in full shadow. Near the boulder field, the air turned cold, enclosed rock cold, not elevation cold. Fine dust drifted from ceiling cracks in a slow, continuous thread, visible in their headlamp beams. 2 hikers resting on a trail above saw the Cabots descend into the boulder field and assumed it was routine. Inside the void, the GoPro footage showed Nella moving toward the exit passage. Her posture shifted. She stopped, looked up, repositioned her weight toward the entrance. Bricks remained deeper in the chamber, near a flat slab he intended to use for a photograph. She returned toward him. There was no confirmed causal impact sequence, but apparently, as she straightened into position, her movement disturbed interlocked debris supporting an overhead slab. Small fragments fell first, followed seconds later by a sharp, structural collapse. The 2 hikers above heard a single sharp crack, followed immediately by a low concussion they felt through the soles of their boots. They ran toward the sound. When they reached the boulder field, the entrance slot was obstructed by fresh debris collapse. Dust still hung in the air. They called emergency services from the rim after confirming they could not safely re-enter. Rescue teams arrived after nightfall. Structural teams declared the void too unstable for immediate entry. Recovery attempts in rotating shifts over several days were repeatedly suspended due to continuing movement in the debris field. The operation was ultimately transitioned into a deferred recovery status due to persistent collapse risk conditions. 3 weeks later, a secondary partial collapse exposed a portion of the void interior, and a park survey crew discovered the remains. The coroner's findings indicated both individuals died from compressive crush injuries to the thorax and skull, consistent with sudden overhead collapse. Death was assessed as likely rapid, with incapacitation occurring almost immediately. Park officials declined to identify the exact location publicly to discourage further entries. The GoPro footage was retained as part of the investigation. Lesson learned: don't trust sources that had no business being trusted in a place that had no business being entered.
It was October 2nd, 2013, and the afternoon light at Lipan Point cast sharp shadows across the metal railing where a mother stood holding her 8-month-old son against her chest. The overlook was moderately crowded, and visitors waited their turn to step close to the railing. Helicopters passed overhead periodically, and the air carried the faint scent of dust and pine from the canyon below. Rachel Kim had arrived with her mother just after 2, driving up from temporary housing near where her husband was stationed. She was 27 and had given birth to her son the previous February. She had no family nearby and spent most days alone while her husband worked long shifts. Her online presence was extensive. She maintained a parenting blog, an Instagram account with over 2,000 followers, and posted daily updates in multiple forums. Friends later described her as anxious and perfectionistic, someone who read every parenting book and second-guessed every decision. She had been diagnosed with postpartum anxiety 3 months after her son's birth, but had stopped attending therapy after 2 sessions. Her infant was fussy and startled easily, and Rachel had developed a habit of holding him constantly to keep him calm. This constant vigilance, born of anxiety and isolation, may have amplified the risk at the overlook. Lipan Point is a popular South Rim overlook with a waist-high metal railing along the edge. The vertical bars were wide enough for small objects or limbs to pass through. That afternoon, Rachel stood at the railing with her son in her left arm, leaning forward slightly to angle her phone for a selfie that would capture both of them with the canyon behind them. Her mother stood a few feet behind, holding a diaper bag. The drive to capture the perfect image placed them closer to danger than most visitors realized. At approximately 2:37, a helicopter passed nearby, its noise sudden and loud. Several witnesses later described the sound as startling, and one tourist's video captured the moment. The infant jerked violently in Rachel's arms, arching his back and twisting his torso. Rachel's grip shifted, her hand slipping from his back to his leg. She tried to pull him closer, but his body squirmed again, and he slid downward through her arms. His small torso passed between two of the railing bars before Rachel could react. She lunged forward, her hand grazing his foot, but he was already gone. The accident occurred within seconds, leaving no observable opportunity for intervention. Rachel screamed and grabbed the railing, trying to climb over it. Her mother and two nearby tourists pulled her back as she thrashed and shouted. Another visitor called emergency services at 2:38. Responders arrived within 9 minutes, but the terrain below Lipan Point is steep and heavily vegetated, making immediate recovery impossible. A helicopter was dispatched at 2:51, but the search required technical climbers due to the angle of the slope. The infant's body was located at 417 on a rocky ledge, approximately 800 feet below the overlook. The sheer depth and isolation of the drop underscored the overwhelming helplessness of the situation. A post-mortem examination determined that the infant died from catastrophic blunt force trauma to the head and torso. The injuries were consistent with a fall from significant height onto a hard surface. The skull was fractured in multiple places, and there was severe internal bleeding. Death would have occurred within seconds of impact, likely before the infant could experience prolonged distress. The fall happened immediately after the infant slipped from her arms, resulting in fatal injuries within seconds. Rachel Kim deleted all of her social media accounts within a week of the incident and ceased public communication. Her family declined to speak with investigators beyond initial interviews, and she and her husband relocated out of state within 2 months. No charges were filed. The aftermath left her completely isolated, a private grief unseen by the wider public. Internal safety reviews were later conducted at overlooks along the South Rim. Within 18 months, modifications were made at Lipan Point and 3 other locations to reduce the spacing between vertical bars. Though no official announcement referenced the incident directly, the slow, systemic response illustrates how preventable hazards often persist until tragedy forces action. It was March 27, 2018, and mid-morning sun warmed a South Rim viewpoint where a low stone barrier wall marked the canyon's edge. Beyond the wall, a narrow limestone ledge roughly 20 inches wide was visible approximately 14 feet below, its outer edge angling slightly away from the canyon wall. The drop beyond the ledge measured several hundred feet. Coltrane Wexley was 23 years old and in his final semester as a graphic design student in Atlanta, Georgia. He was visiting the Grand Canyon during spring break with 3 college friends, his first time seeing the canyon in person. An internship interview was scheduled for the following week, and he had spent months preparing a digital portfolio of his work. At the viewpoint, Coltrane stood beside the stone barrier, showing the portfolio on his phone to 2 of his friends. He scrolled through several projects, pointing out the designs he planned to present during the interview. Friends later told investigators that he mentioned he hadn't backed up the files in months and that losing the phone would effectively end the internship opportunity. As he leaned casually against the barrier while holding the phone, it slipped from his jacket pocket. It cleared the rim edge and came to rest on a narrow limestone ledge roughly 14 feet below. Display facing upward, the screen still lit. One friend immediately told him to leave it. The ledge sat well below the barrier, with several hundred feet of open canyon beneath it. Coltrane looked over the wall anyway, studying the rock face until he identified what appeared to be shallow handholds in the limestone. Within seconds, he began climbing down. He reached the narrow ledge. The handholds had held on the way down. The phone lay beside his shoe, its screen cracked but still glowing. He tried to hand it up to a friend leaning over the barrier, but the distance was too great. Instead, he tossed it upward. His friend reached for it but fumbled the catch. The phone bounced once on the rim and slid onto the paved viewing area above. It had made it back safely. Now standing on a ledge, barely wider than his shoes, Coltrane turned back toward the wall to climb out. The limestone fractured beneath him without warning. A thin, outer slab broke away from the formation under his weight. His hands reached for the wall, but found no hold at that height. The broken section of limestone and Coltrane's body dropped away from the cliff face together and disappeared into open air. Both friends witnessed the fall. Emergency services were called immediately. Coltrane's body was located on a rocky shelf, approximately 280 feet below. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be open cranial vault fractures, bilateral hemopneumothorax, and comminuted spinal and pelvic fractures, consistent with extreme distance freefall polytrauma. Investigators examined the fracture point. The separated section showed significant weathering along its underside, consistent with limestone exfoliation, where the outer face progressively detaches through thermal expansion and frost wedging, and can appear intact from above while already partially separated beneath. The phone was recovered from the rim surface. The portfolio and interview materials were intact. The park authority installed additional barrier fencing at the viewpoint within the same season. His design program held a memorial at the end of the academic year. It was June 14th, 2016. The south rim at Pipe Creek Vista shimmered under afternoon heat that could kill as efficiently as any fall. And by day's end, Hector Villalobos would discover both truths in the worst possible sequence. Hector wasn't reckless by nature, just overfamiliar. The 28-year-old landscape photographer from Tucson had hiked the Grand Canyon's trails dozens of times, capturing sunrise shots and dramatic rim perspectives for his growing portfolio. He'd built a modest following on social media, showcasing Arizona's landscapes, earning enough through print sales and local gallery exhibitions to supplement his part-time work at a photography supply store. Friends described him as talented but casual, the kind of person who'd hike in sandals because he knew the terrain. For this climb, he wore worn hiking boots and gripped natural handholds along the pillar, relying entirely on his experience rather than any protective equipment. That morning, Hector had posted on social media about his plan to climb a pillar at Pipe Creek Vista for an unobstructed lunch view. A climber reportedly saw him arrive at the pullout around 11:30 in the morning, carrying only his camera bag, a sandwich, and a half-empty water bottle. The temperature was already 94 degrees and climbing. In summer, the Grand Canyon's inner gorge can exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit, with rock surfaces heating far beyond that. Under those conditions, dehydration can set in quickly. A couple eating lunch at a picnic table near the parking area watched Hector scale the pillar using natural handholds. The ascent took roughly 8 minutes. The pillar's summit was flat enough to sit, perhaps 6 feet across, surrounded by sheer drops on 3 sides. They observed him settle in, unpack his lunch, and appear to be eating while checking his camera. The couple finished their meal over the next 20 minutes, discussing their afternoon plans, occasionally glancing at the pillar where Hector remained visible as a small figure against the sky. When they looked again, at 12:45 in the afternoon, Hector was gone. The woman initially assumed he'd climbed down while they weren't watching, but something about the empty pillar troubled her. Her husband walked to the edge of the viewing area and scanned downward, seeing nothing unusual. They returned to their car, dismissing the concern. 15 minutes later, a hiker on the rim trail below the vista heard what she initially mistook for a rockfall. Moving around a switchback, she encountered Hector's body sprawled across an angular slab of limestone 30 feet from the pillar's base. His limbs were positioned unnaturally, his head angled wrong. Blood pooled beneath his skull where it had struck the rock. The body lay unbraced, arms at his sides rather than extended defensively. The hiker immediately called emergency services at 1:02 in the afternoon, her voice shaking as she described the scene. Park rangers and emergency medical technicians arrived within 20 minutes, hiking down the nearby switchback trail to reach the body. The medical examiner's report noted multiple skull fractures consistent with high-impact blunt force trauma, along with fractured ribs and internal bleeding. No defensive injuries appeared on his hands or arms. Core body temperature at recovery suggested severe hyperthermia. The determination concluded he had likely lost consciousness from heat stroke while seated on the pillar, then toppled forward during the resulting collapse, falling 40 feet and landing unbraced on the uneven rock surface. Death occurred on impact. The park's ranger station logged the incident as an accidental fatality related to heat exposure and unauthorized climbing. The incident prompted rangers to reinforce existing warnings about off-trail climbing and extreme heat exposure. Park signage warning against off-trail climbing was noted in the report, highlighting that Hector had ignored official guidance. Hector's camera, recovered with his body, contained his final photos: lunch, sky, canyon views.
It was the 22nd of May, 2020, at the Grand Canyon South Rim in Arizona. The weather was clear, and dozens of tourists had gathered for helicopter tours that offered aerial views of the canyon's cliffs, rock formations, and vast desert landscape. Esmond Cassander was 38 years old and lived in Las Vegas, Nevada. He worked as a marketing consultant and spent much of his free time traveling and creating content for social media. For the past 5 years, he had taken a vacation every May to visit a different location. This year, he had chosen the Grand Canyon. He wanted photographs that captured the sheer scale of the canyon and hoped to return home with images that looked more impressive than anything he had taken before.
That afternoon, Esmond booked an open-door helicopter photography tour.
Before takeoff, the crew gave a safety briefing and fitted each passenger with a harness attached to the aircraft. They repeatedly warned passengers not to loosen or tamper with the restraints during the flight. Esmond listened while preparing his camera equipment. "I always pay attention when a safety rule gets repeated multiple times. Usually that's because somebody has ignored it before, and what happens next proves that." About 20 minutes into the flight, the helicopter reached one of the most scenic sections of the canyon. Esmond began taking photographs through the open doorway. Although the harness restricted some of his movement, it was designed to prevent passengers from falling while leaning out for pictures. He had already taken dozens of photographs, but none matched the image he had imagined before the trip. As the helicopter passed over one of the canyon's deepest sections, he became frustrated that the harness prevented him from leaning out as far as he wanted. He wanted a shot that looked more dramatic than the ones he had already taken.
After a few moments of hesitation, Esmond convinced himself that the restriction was only getting in the way.
Despite repeated warnings, he tampered with part of his restraint system. He told himself he only needed a little more freedom to lean out and that nothing would go wrong. I think that's how a lot of dangerous decisions happen. People don't usually think they're taking a huge risk. They convince themselves they're only bending the rules a little. Then, a few minutes later, the helicopter banked gently while following the canyon's contours. The maneuver was routine and well within normal operating limits. As Esmond leaned outward to take another photograph, he lost his balance. Without the restraint properly securing him, he slipped from the aircraft and fell into the canyon below, and he didn't get up after that. The pilot immediately declared an emergency and returned to the nearest landing area, but there was nothing rescuers could do for Esmond. His body was recovered later that day. Investigators found no mechanical problems with the helicopter and determined that the accident occurred after Esmond tampered with his safety restraint during the flight. The medical examiner recorded his cause of death as multiple traumatic injuries sustained in the fall. Authorities found no evidence of pilot error or equipment failure, and no charges were filed. The camera recovered from the scene contained dozens of photographs he had already taken. The final photograph he leaned out to capture was never taken.
It was the 11th of October 2014 on the South Kaibab Trail, a trail where the canyon narrows, the exposure sharpens, and the margin between a routine morning and something irreversible compresses to almost nothing. Ella Roots was 34 years old, a professional horse trainer from New Zealand traveling through the American Southwest between competitions. She had spent over a decade conditioning performance horses for international circuits. Now, apparently, she booked the mule descent as a detour. Knowing horses herself, it's assumed that to her, it was not a serious undertaking. At the trailhead briefing, other riders later told investigators that Ela made her opinion of the operation audible, referring to the mules as overgrown ponies within earshot of the wrangler. I think that attitude suggests a level of overconfidence that may have dulled her usual caution in unfamiliar terrain and conditions. During a gear check stop, she placed her hand on her assigned mule's girth area and commented on the fit. The wrangler visually confirmed the tack and moved on without issue. The Wrangler noticed but completed the standard safety recheck before the group continued down. 8 riders descended in single file through cold, fast-moving air. The trail cut through exposed limestone switchbacks, the outer edge breaking away into steep red sandstone slopes, fractured ledges, and terraced drop-offs on one side and solid rock rising on the other. Now, I've been to Skeleton Point, and it's worth noting that the canyon wall below those terraces still descends roughly 2,000 feet toward the valley floor in uneven stages. The exposure from the saddle is not subtle, it is immediate. Roughly halfway down, the wind shifted and pushed hard through the corridor. A maintenance tarp had partially worked loose from anchor points below the trail. When a gust caught it, the tarp snapped outward and cracked against the rock wall. The sound was sharp and close, causing a brief, startled response among several mules, including a sudden halt and sidestep along the line. The mule under Ella sidestepped toward the inner wall, then corrected back under Wrangler voice commands. Now the next part confused me. Ela shifted her weight forward in response, tightening her grip on the reins in a way that conflicted with standard instruction to stay centered and relaxed. I'm not sure if she was nervous or something, but for someone experienced, this was unusual. Either way, her forward shift placed her slightly off balance during the correction. Riders behind her described it happening in a tight sequence rather than a single violent motion. She slipped partially out of the saddle as her right foot came loose from the stirrup. The mule continued forward after the brief hesitation. 2 riders described her momentarily dangling off the right side before her foot fully disengaged. As she lost her seat, she fell to the side and struck the trail edge, then slid downward along the sloped rock just beyond the main path. The movement carried her over the outer drop after she lost footing on the loose scree. A tourist on a lower switchback reported seeing a body impact the cliff face once during the descent before coming to rest on a rock shelf approximately 400 feet below. The trail guide radioed park dispatch within seconds of the fall. A rescue helicopter reached the shelf in 42 minutes, but could only confirm death at the scene. No single injury was listed as the isolated cause of death. The combination was unsurvivable. The briefing had been clear, and Ela had been present for it. I think she simply believed it did not apply to her, and I think that belief was the variable that mattered most. There is a version of this day where she walks off the trail at the bottom, unsettled but intact. That version required one decision she did not make.